Hey everybody, today I am going to walk through my chapter 12 notes. This is the first part of Unit 5 for AP Environmental Science. Bear with me because this is the first web lecture that I've done. So I'll try to go at a pace that makes sense for people taking notes. The material that we're going to cover today include food production, agriculture, and pest management. Alternatively, you can read all of Chapter 12 if you want to get some of the same information. I may supplement the information in the textbook with some outside resources, as well as additional images in these notes. So before we begin, you should be familiar with the unit objectives. Some of these we will cover in class, some of them we will only cover in these lectures. So make sure you're familiar with the objectives and can point to when you've met an objective and when you still need to review an objective. We talked in class about food security and who has access to it. There's a large amount of food insecurity caused by poverty, caused by natural disasters, caused by logistics issues in terms of distribution. The serious problems associated with food insecurity include chronic undernutrition, so not having enough food to make the basic energy needs of our body. Specifically, do you get enough calories per day compared to the number of calories you have to burn for your day-to-day activities and ultimate survival? And if you do not, you are considered chronically under nutritioned. And that leads to severe hunger, and your body starts to use its own resources, its fat deposits, even its protein deposits, etc. We also have a variety of malnutritions. These are deficiency of protein or another sort of key nutrient, and this describes the diet of 1/7 of our planet, and results in a severe number of premature deaths when people aren't getting the dietary necessities that they need. Vitamin A, zinc, iron, and iodine are some of the really common examples of nutrients that aren't being properly obtained through diets around the world. Alternatively, we also have overnutrition, where our food energy intake exceeds the amount of energy use, and this results in obesity, lowering life expectancy, increasing the threat of disease, and lowering productivity. And that applies to about 2/7 of the world, which is kind of crazy to think that we have billions who are malnutritioned, we have millions who are undernutritioned, and then we also have billions who are overnutritioned. So how do we attempt to feed everyone? Most hungry people in the world live in low-income and less developed countries. And can only afford, sort of on the left-hand side, this low-protein, high-carbohydrate vegetarian diet. That includes grains, rice, etc. For a lot of people, especially in the United States, we supplement our diet with meat. And the production of that meat requires an incredible input of those vegetarian-based materials. And that's why, an argument for sustainability is to avoid eating meat or to eat less meat, because it sort of eliminates this middle step as we're seeing here. Today we're going to talk about methods for agriculture. The U.S. has gone through its own green revolution. We'll talk about a green revolution to be able to provide the amount of food that we need. But the amount of our actual land that is used for food that we eat is fairly limited. A lot of our land is used as pasture or rangeland. A lot of our land is used to grow food that then produces feed for livestock. And you can see that the food we eat is limited to a smaller subsection of our land. This is a great map because it also shows U.S. Housing, commercial industry, areas that are wetlands or deserts, timberlands and wilderness areas, areas set aside for national and state parks, etc. So this, most of our land goes towards animal production, and then some of our land goes towards plant production. So it's good to know that. So in the course of this unit, you want to be able to compare multiple types of agriculture methods. And we can start with sort of traditional subsistence agriculture. This is the most basic form of farming on our planet. We've been doing it for 10,000 years, basically since the end of the Ice Age. And in traditional subsistence agriculture, we use either our own physical labor or maybe that of draft animals. You can see a plow being driven by these oxen. And you basically produce enough food to feed your own family. So you are responsible for the food that you grow, and you have to meet your own nutritional needs with the food that you grow. In this case, you may trade or exchange food with others to get different variety of products, but for the most part, it requires an incredible amount of time and intensive labor on the part of the people who live this way to be able to sustain themselves. Traditional intensive agriculture is a step up, where we start to use manure-based fertilizers, we start to use water inputs through basic irrigation methods, and we can sell any of the excess food that we produce on that land at the market. So it's sort of a step up towards more intensive agriculture, but it uses a lot of the same traditional methods. And one of those methods is a polyculture, the practice of growing several crops at once, where let's say you have one plot of land, but you've divided it amongst multiple types of crops, as opposed to a farm that only grows one single crop. Crop diversity is better than what we would call a monoculture, which is one type of crop, because it gives you options. Let's say one of your crops fails, at least you have the other ones to fall back on. It can also lead to more nutrients being turned over and used properly. For example, if in a polyculture you include a nitrogen fixing plant, that's going to benefit the other plants that are grown on that land. So a lot of traditional indigenous practices rely on polyculture. For areas that are forested, they have to be cleared in order for people to grow the crops that they want. So slash and burn agriculture is also a method that's used in sort of traditional agriculture activities, where farmers will burn or clear a small plot of forest. Typically this is done in a lot of tropical areas. And then they can grow crops in that area for a few years using the nutrients that they've taken from the material that they cleared. Unfortunately, in a lot of tropical locations, the soil doesn't stay very fertile, especially if they're on a sloped location, or if there are there's no roots being kept in the ground to hold those nutrients in. So slash and burn agriculture is still done all over the world, and it works for short periods of time, maybe the period of time of one person's farm for their life, but it's not sustainable over a long period of time. Our food production has launched dramatically since the time of this sort of traditional subsistence or traditional intensive agriculture. Croplands supply 77% of the world's food. There's 14 main crops, but the big three are rice, wheat, and corn. Obviously, rangelands, we said, take up a huge amount of our space, and they produce our meat and animal products. But we've moved towards feedlots, moving away from traditional rangelands, where we can intensify our production of meat. And we'll also talk about the number of fisheries and aquaculture projects that are going on right now that provide another source of protein for a lot of people on this planet. We've moved towards industrialized agriculture. Heavy equipment runs on fossil fuels. You can see this carbine. And we use irrigated water that we have to bring in from other locations or dig into the ground to be able to get. And we also supplement our plants to grow faster using inorganic fertilizers. And we remove unwanted pests and other plants from our land using herbicides and pesticides. Typically in industrialized agriculture products, we have a monoculture, which means we only produce one product. So you can see, in this case, we have one particular crop being grown in either of these locations. The term plantation agriculture is not used very widely anymore in the United States, but is certainly used in other locations. Classic plantation example is sugarcane or bananas in tropical locations. And essentially they're growing a cash crop in their country, but they're going to export the majority of that crop that is grown. And the launch of industrialized agriculture around the world is characterized by what we call green revolutions. So we use these industrialized methods, whether it's irrigation, herbicide use, pesticide use, and the introduction of inorganic fertilizers to greatly increase the amount of product that we can produce in one plot of land over the course of one season. So we needed to develop monocultures of high yield varieties. In other words, they have to be able to produce a lot of the desired product comparatively to the amount of unusable material like leaves or stalk or sprouts. And most of these plants have been bred either through artificial selection or genetic modification to grow really fast. And so we can practice what we call multiple cropping. With these faster growing crops and added fertilizers, farmers can grow multiple rounds of crops within a single season. There have been two green revolutions in the United States. The first green revolution began in Mexico. We've seen these changes happen in China, happen in India, and sort of all around the world. But we've increased our food capita production in the United States 30% in just about 20 years. And in total, since we started doing high-level industrial agriculture, we've increased the food output per capita of this world by about over 300%, which is just an insane statistic. And the biggest crop, at least in the United States, is corn. Second biggest wheat, and then upcoming is rice. So irrigation methods. These advances allowed modern day agriculture to rapidly expand. Surface irrigation is where we basically flood large surface areas with water. It's relatively cheap. It requires really little energy because you essentially just open a dam and let water in. And you can use sort of lower quality water. You don't have to test your water as much as you would with other systems, but it's insanely water intensive. And you can see it here at the top, we've flooded a whole field. Or here we have what we call furrows, where we only flood the region between our lines of crops that have been grown. Sprinkler irrigation uses spray nozzles and pressurized water to basically deliver water to a more centralized location. These are expensive to install and they require a fair amount of infrastructure. And they're less efficient when it's dry because water starts to evaporate really rapidly. The same is true if it's windy. Water can be pushed away from the crops that they're meant to be delivered to. And we also end up with a fair amount of flooding or damage to crops by wetting non-root areas. These sprinklers can be fixed or they can be movable. But movable sprinklers waste more water than others, but they can be transferred between fields. We also have fixed sprinkler systems, which basically dig straight down into a groundwater resource and bring that water to the top and then disperse it. We're starting to move towards more efficient systems with low energy precision application or low elevation application. So here we have like a traditional sprinkler system. And it's actually a pivot system, so it would pivot from a central point around an entire circle. So here's a central point, and that system basically reaches across the field, and then would go ahead and pivot all the way around to be able to deliver the water to that entire area. And you can see from flights, if you've ever taken flights over the central part of the United States, these pivot systems are everywhere. And we see the traditional circle of green that's associated with them, and then in fields that don't use them, you may not see that traditional pattern. Drip irrigation is the more efficient method. Water is supplied at a very low pressure, very slowly, directly to the plant's roots, so there's no airspace between where the water is released and when it gets there. And it results in really less erosion than flooding or surface irrigation. It can be automated to only deliver water when it's absolutely necessary, but it's extremely expensive and requires extensive infrastructure. So here you can see a whole field that has been fitted with a drip irrigation system, providing water directly to the plant with just a few drips, and that plant sort of gets the most water that it can. There's no wasted water being blown away in the air. There's no excess water leading to erosion. But again, it's really expensive to set up this type of system and requires a lot of maintenance. But it is the most efficient method that we've invented so far. Fertilizer use has increased rapidly during green revolutions. And the three main fertilizers are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen being the one that has the highest rate of applications. In total, application rate has increased significantly under the Green Revolution. We went from about 46 pounds per acre per year to 140 pounds per acre to year, roughly speaking, at least in the United States. And without these nitrogen fertilizers, we don't think we could have supported the world population that we have. So essentially we're able to feed the world because of these products. And fertilizer application rates increased dramatically. You can see the evidence of the Green Revolution here. Up until about the 2000s, when new legislation was passed, when new policies were passed, and the application of all these this amount of nitrogen is being reduced. So we are finding alternative ways to grow plants using more inorganic fertilizers, not necessarily just the synthetic fertilizers. Herbicides are also useful in green revolutions because they manipulate or control the undesirable vegetation that would be competing with the crops that we want. And, you know, these herbicides have to prevent plant growth, so they inhibit cell division, they can block photosynthesis, they can block amino acid production, they can interfere with growth hormones in a plant, etc. The most famous herbicide is glyphosate, and you've probably heard of it because it's referred to as Roundup and sort of the trade name. And it's the most widely used herbicide in the United States. Its use has been tied to genetically engineered glyphosate tolerant plants, which are produced by Monsanto primarily, so that the herbicide kills the weeds, but not the crops. So you can sort of widespread application of Roundup to a field, and it will only target wild plants, but it won't target your specific genetically engineered plant that is resistant to that particular crop. The vast majority of herbicides are used in the Midwest, where we produce most of our corn and soy. And then finally, the last sort of big piece of a green revolution is pest management. So species interfere with our production of food by invading crops and sort of coming in and using or eating the crop for their own purposes. And so we use widespread pesticides, which are chemicals that kill or control these populations when we don't want them. And, our first earliest pesticides were obviously naturally derived. During the World Wars, we had to start fighting mosquitoes and malaria, and so things like DDT were produced. And now we have both broad spectrum and narrow spectrum agents that can target specific organisms or can just sort of kill a variety of organisms. And the use of these is obviously potentially toxic to humans because the mechanisms by which these materials work could affect our cells as well, right? If we are putting a pesticide out there, it tends to work on the neurological system of a lot of these animals, and it could potentially, obviously, interfere with our neurological systems as well. So, what are we producing? Obviously, we're producing an incredible amount of crops, but we're also producing meat, fish, and shellfish. Meat and animal products are the main protein source for some populations, not all populations. Other populations get them through beans and seeds. But about 56 billion animals are slaughtered annually on this planet, which roughly equates to about 8 animals per capita. But some people don't have access to that meat. And so in industrialized nations, we tend to see the meat consumption be much higher per capita than in nations that are still undergoing industrialization or maybe in their pre-industrial stage. So, when we think about our meat, we think about it growing in these beautiful, pastures. Here we have free-range chicken farm at the bottom. We have free-range cattle at the top. But the vast majority of food that's produced doesn't come from these locations. It comes from a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a CAFO, also known as a feedlot, where we can pack in population in high density, and we can supplement their diet with crop, corn-based or soy-based material that we've grown elsewhere. Or in the case of chickens, often we'll have indoor coops where we pack in thousands of animals and supplement their diet with corn-based or soy-based material that we've grown elsewhere. And the same is true for fish and shellfish. Although, a fair amount of our fish and shellfish is wild caught, almost 50% of it now is raised through aquaculture projects, where shellfish in farm or fish in farms are grown in a pond, a coastal area, in indoor operations. But to produce the amount of protein that our planet eats requires huge energy inputs. And what that means is essentially 10 units of non-renewable fossil fuel energy is used to produce 1 unit of food. So we have a net energy loss over time when we're producing the meat, when we're slaughtering the meat, when we're packaging that meat, when we're transporting it out to locations, when we take it home and we actually put energy in to cook it. All of that timeline, or all of that production line requires inputs of energy at each step. And sort of the reason why meat and shellfish and fish is so is less productive to eat, is less efficient to eat, and far less sustainable is exactly this reason. So what I want to highlight is some food production problems. We've looked at some methods, and we've talked about the types of things that we grow, both cash crops and meat products. But what are the actual problems that are associated with the production of these materials? We'll focus a little bit on soil. Last fall, we did a lab where we looked at the qualities of soil. But we'll talk about sort of the major effects on soil that include erosion, the loss of soil fertility, which requires, the input of fertilizer to counteract. What we call salinization, which is the increase in salts in our soils. Waterlogging, which can come from excessive use of irrigation, but also the opposite of that, desertification, where we are pulling water away in some cases. And then we also sometimes see an increased acidity in our soils. Water is wasted during the agriculture process, and we're depleting an incredible amount of our groundwater found in aquifers, particularly in the central locations in the United States, but also in the Central Valley of California. The amount of runoff that comes from irrigation leads to sediment pollution, leads to pollution from pesticides and herbicides, leads to excess fertilizer in aquatic systems that can result in algal blooms and fish kills. So we're definitely seeing a major impact on our water resources. Air pollution is certainly a result of industrialized farming. We have incredible emissions of greenhouse gases, including CO2 and N2O and methane, CH4. But we also have air pollutants that are introduced from fossil fuel use and pesticide spray beyond greenhouse gases. And when we get to the air pollution unit, we'll talk more about those. We're seeing a dramatic loss and degradation of grasslands, wetlands, forested, etc., that are being removed or cleared for cultivation. We see loss of biodiversity in natural systems, whether we're killing off pests or whether natural organisms are suffering the effects of runoff or exposure to herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. And as we move towards more genetically engineered crops, we're seeing a loss of genetic diversity in wild crop strains. And the number of varieties that we grow is dramatically lower than it used to be. For humans, what are the effects that we suffer as a result of food production? Nitrates in the drinking water, pesticides in the drinking water get into our systems, and we see that happen. And we also record an incredible number of bacterial contaminations from meat production, and those contaminations can happen in meat products, but they can also happen in our plant products as well, and you hear about recalls that are associated with E. coli outbreaks or listeria outbreaks, etc., etc. So soil erosion is the movement of soil by wind or water. Usually in agriculture, this is induced by the amount of irrigation, particularly flood irrigation or surface irrigation, but it can also be associated with overgrazing and with the sort of removal of plant material from certain locations. We have sheet erosion, where the surface water or wind basically peels off layers of topsoil. We have rill erosion, where surface water will move and make channels, and then sometimes those channels come together to make really huge gullies, and you can see that happened here on this agricultural land, where we have a significant amount of erosion happening and removing this topsoil, and that topsoil is flowing out and flowing down to somewhere else. Desertification is the loss of productivity and rich nutrients in our soil, but also the drying of our soil. This is usually caused, again, by overgrazing, by deforestation, by the removal of plants from the surface, and it can lead to a significant number of issues. We've seen examples of desertification lead to loss of products or loss of productivity in a number of different crops. One of the biggest ones is seeing desertification that led to basically incredibly high demand for inputs of wheat products in the Middle East. And they think that issues around this may be associated with the conflict in Syria over the last decade, where farmers were being forced to move from their land because they simply didn't have the productivity that they used to, and entire communities were lost. Salinization and waterlogging is sort of the opposite of that, where irrigation is depositing salts that are being pulled up from groundwater or moved from other resources, and then as the water evaporates away, the only thing that's left is that salt, and so it builds up in the soil over time, and plants that aren't salt tolerant aren't going to be able to survive here for very long. Waterlogging results from trying to grow plants above a clay layer, where the clay layer doesn't allow water to permeate down or percolate down, and can just sort of sit there at the top, and actually drown the root system of the plants, because our roots in our plants need to do gas exchange. They don't just need to do water uptake. And so if you waterlog the roots of plants, it can actually lead to the loss of those crops over time. So if you think back to our soils lab, we need sort of the perfect combination of water retention and water percolation to be able to grow our crops. And if you have too much clay in your soil, you're not going to be able to do that. In terms of the protein production, with these CAFOs, with these major feedlots, with advances in agriculture, we've increased our yields. And we've done it with less land use, which a lot of people argue is a good thing. For aquaculture projects, we've done it with less fuel use, which again, a lot of people argue is a good thing. If we concentrate our meat production in smaller areas, we can reduce overgrazing, which leads to less soil erosion and protects wild biodiversity. So there are definitely some benefits to moving towards these. I think the reason that we've done it is higher profits, and companies can see that they've had the chance to increase their profits over time. But what are some disadvantages? So the industrialized meat production requires incredible inputs of grain or fish meat or water, and to transport that material and to run these farms or run these feedlots requires an incredible input of fuel, which leads to greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, these cattle feedlots increase the amount of methane that they produce as well. The other problem is what to do with animal wastes, which can pollute nearby water resources. So that's a big issue right now. And then finally, the amount of disease that can spread in a concentrated animal feed organization is high because the population density is high. And so to counteract the spread of those diseases, we've used incredible amounts of antibiotics, which leads to genetic resistance in humans, genetic resistance in these cattle, and we've just seen a lot of issues centered around disease spread and antibiotics. We've got basically antibiotic-resistant E. coli lines or lineages that are now very common in the meat industry. And so we don't know if we're going to be able to keep up with that. In terms of disadvantages associated with aquaculture, we still need lots of land to grow the feed to fish. And those fish produce a fair amount of waste, which enters immediately into the surrounding ecosystem. And so, we've lost some coastal ecosystems to aquaculture projects. And again, because we're concentrating our animals all in one location, the result is the spread of diseases. And, do we want to be putting antibiotic materials into our farmed fish, which can easily get out into nature and, again, result in AMR or antimicrobial resistance developing over time. Another very controversial method for growing our meat and our crops is GMO, or genetic modification. So traditional artificial selection results in crossbreeding, and we have basically, developed our desired varieties in our species by choosing who breeds and who doesn't, right? But today, genetic engineering is being used to develop and improve strains of crops and of livestock by altering DNA. We'll talk about some of the methods for that in class, but essentially 80% of our corn, soy, and cotton in the United States is genetically engineered. If you go to the store, about 80% of the food on the shelves has some sort of GMO in it. GMOs are not required to be labeled in the United States officially. There are some states that require it. A lot of other nations require it. But most groups that grow non-GMO varieties now are advertising that on their packaging. And some of the modifications that have been made provide resistance to heat, to cold, resistance to herbicides like Roundup, resistant to pests and parasites and disease, tolerance to drought or changes in soil chemistry. And so, we can choose certified organic food, which makes no use of GMO seeds or ingredients and uses organic fertilizers. Or we can go with the GM varieties, but there are some downsides to using them. I personally am pro-GMO because I think we do need more crops that can feed our growing population. But there's a lot of controversy, and we'll cover some of the angles of that controversy in class. And here, are some of them. Essentially, they require less fertilizer, need less water, are resistant to all of these environmental factors, and they grow really fast, and they tolerate the herbicides that we use, and they reduce the energy needs. But the genetic effects on the ecosystem is serious. The uncontrolled genes lead to hybridization with wild plants, and we can basically see a loss of genetic biodiversity over time. Because they're resistant to herbicides, that means farmers tend to use more herbicides on their product, and they outcompete natural varieties. One of the sort of classic examples of GMO was golden rice, which was bred with higher vitamin A basically concentration within a single grain, and was projected to be used across the world to supplement areas where we have vitamin A deficiencies. We still haven't launched this product on a huge scale due to a lot of opposition that has gone on, but people are still trying to basically get this product out and allow golden rice to solve some of the vitamin A deficiencies around the world. When we talk about solutions, we want to think about some sustainable food production methods. We want to improve our soil fertility and reduce erosion, right? We want to retain more water in the soil during drought years, and we want to use less energy. We want to lower our carbon emissions. We want to eliminate pollutions associated with pesticides and herbicides. We want to increase biodiversity, and we want to have less negative impact on wildlife. So these are sort of our goals when it comes to sustainable food production. And that is achieved in some cases through organic farming. We can also shift customer choices as well so that we choose products that are coming from more sustainable places. We can personally choose to waste less food. We can eat less meat. We can buy organic foods or eat local foods or compost our food waste. So there's a lot of choices that we can make to be able to achieve these goals overall. In the United States, we monitor food production through the EPA, through the USDA, and through the FDA. So we want to know, okay, what does the actual production of the food look like? And that is associated with the USDA. We want to know what are the impacts on the environmental resources when we do that food production, and that is monitored by the EPA. And then when we finally produce the food and send it to market and give it to the consumer, we want to make sure it's safe, and that's monitored by the FDA. One of the things that we regulate is pesticide use. There's been a couple of laws passed by Congress to monitor pesticide use. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act was designed to assess risk and lower the risk to humans of the use of these materials. The Food Quality Protection Act was launched due to understanding that there were possible negative effects of pesticides on children and adults. And basically, since these acts have been launched, we've banned a number of pesticides in the United States. Glyphosate is not one of the ones that we've banned, but in some cases it is banned around the world. So how can we protect our crops if we don't use pesticides? There are alternatives to pesticides. We could use a polyculture where maybe that pest will not like a new plant that you grow and it will leave the location. We can use natural genetic resistances to pests to breed that into our crops and make them more resistant to pests on their own. We use biological control, which is the introduction of an animal to prey on a pest, and that has been successful in some cases, and it's been very unsuccessful in some cases as well. We can use naturally produced hormones or pheromones to dissuade pests from entering crops. We can use trap crops, which are basically a crop that circles the main crop and hopefully catches most pests as they enter into a field so that they don't hurt or harm the main crop. There's a lot of alternatives that we can use, and right now integrated pest management is the practice of basically looking at each crop, looking at the pests that affect it, evaluating what the best method is, whether it's a combination of pesticides and polyculture and biocontrol and trap cropping, etc., to care for that crop in a way that is more sustainable. Right now we're also trying to improve food security across the world and improve the use of government subsidies because governments have the ability to control the price of food with price caps. They provide subsidies to farmers by providing tax breaks, price supports, monetary incentives to upgrade equipment, etc. And they can be used effectively, but they do alter the cost of the goods at market. And so in some cases, we've purposefully increased production of certain products, like corn, for example, or we subsidize certain products to reduce their cost, such as dairy and the price of milk. And there's a lot of NGOs, there's a lot of government organizations that are working to improve food security. UNICEF is one of the main ones on this planet that's working to solve world hunger and malnutrition and undernutrition issues. Other alternatives include polyvarietal cultivation, so planting several genetic varieties to see which variety is best. Intercropping, so 2 or more different crops grown at the same time in a plot, and this is sort of a nice example of intercropping. Agroforestry is practiced now, which is more sustainable for crops like coffee and chocolate or cocoa, because they can basically be planted in the understory of a forest without having to clear the forest. Obviously, we talked about polycultures and using multiple different plants together, and how that can result in higher yields because some of the plants that you use should be nitrogen fixing plants to draw that nitrogen out of the atmosphere to basically supplement the plants that need that nitrogen in the soil. Tillage results in a lot of the erosion that we talked about, and so there's different tilling methods that we use now to basically reduce the amount of topsoil that's removed and instead do our planting in a more efficient way. So some sort of conservation tillage should be used. We also have alternative planting techniques such as terracing, windbreaks, cover crops, alley cropping, contour strip planting like you see in this picture, as opposed to clearing a whole area and increasing erosion. And we know during the Dust Bowl, a lot of lessons were learned that promoted terracing to protect farmland as opposed to flat farmlands that resulted in incredible amount of erosion. We're also moving towards organic fertilizers and away from the manufactured inorganic fertilizers. And we're using more and more composted materials to return nutrients to the soil as well. In sort of food deserts, we're starting to promote greenhouse use and the use of hydroponics, so growing plants by exposing roots to nutrient-rich water without the need for soil. This means that we can grow them almost anywhere indoors. We have a number of hydroponic projects in San Francisco. They can be grown in these dense urban areas by using roofs, using basements, etc. And because it's a closed system, it's not as exposed to the wild. It's not going to interfere with wild diversity. It's not going to be exposed to as many diseases, and you're able to have a really tight control on the amount of water used. You can recapture the water that you have used immediately and use it again. So it's just a lot easier to control if you use this.